Hello and welcome to the National Call on Coronavirus, Disasters, Housing, and Homelessness. I'm Sarah Stadian. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're going to give it a moment or two for people to join on the line, and then we'll get started. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's National Call on Coronavirus, Disasters, Housing, and Homelessness. We're going to give folks a little bit more time to join on the line, and then we'll get started right away. Thanks. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining today's call. As a reminder, participants on today's call include homeless shelter and service providers, housing providers, housing advocates, researchers, low-income renters, and people experiencing homelessness, as well as congressional staff, media, and philanthropy. We have so much to talk about on today's call, but most exciting is that finally, after months of all of our hard work, a relief package with rental assistance is within reach. We know that Hill negotiations are moving very, very quickly. And on today's call, we'll talk about what's the latest going on and how advocates can make one final push to make sure that we can get rent relief now. We're also going to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on Black women, hear more about a new report on evictions and barriers to housing opportunity, as well as receive updates from the field and more. As a reminder to folks, if you have questions, feel free to ask your questions in our Q&A box, and we'll make sure we get to as many of them as possible during the call. So I'll start off with a Capitol Hill update because I know this is something that many of us are all very, very interested in. As I mentioned before, congressional leaders are moving very quickly to negotiate the final details in a bipartisan relief package that would provide some immediate aid, including $25 billion in emergency rental assistance for the next 3 months. We know that committee staff had an hours-long meeting yesterday. They've been working throughout the weekend. We think a deal could be reached as soon as the next couple of days. And by that, I mean more details around that overall structure that they agreed to last week. As we mentioned before, this bipartisan group of senators released last Tuesday a broad overview of an outline of how $908 billion in a relief plan would come together. It included the $25 billion in emergency rental assistance, but it also included about $160 billion in direct aid to state and local governments and a $300 per week extension of the federal unemployment benefits, along with other provisions. At the time, the bill did not include much needed funding for homelessness services or providers of federally assisted housing. Although we do hear that negotiators are considering an extended eviction moratorium as part of the deal. It seems from those conversations that we've been having with Hill staff that the $25 billion in emergency rental assistance is pretty much set. I don't think we're at risk of losing or money from that or going above it. So that $25 billion is a firm number. And I think what we'd encourage all of you guys to do, and what we are certainly doing, is keeping our focus on making sure that these resources are reaching people who are most in need, who are most at risk of facing evictions in the coming months, and those are people with the very lowest incomes. $25 billion certainly is not enough to meet even the current backlog of rent, which experts estimate is somewhere between $34 billion and $70 billion. But these are critical resources, and we want to make sure that they're being deployed as quickly as possible, but also as targeted as possible to where the need is. So it's really important that you continue to engage with your members of Congress as we see this move forward. We are getting good signs that this is, we're seeing support pick up for this proposal. More senators have come forward indicating that they would be supportive of this package. We know that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer have both accepted this proposal as being a baseline for negotiations. And while Mitch McConnell has sort of poo-pooed it and said that he's more interested in his own proposal, that's $500 billion, it seems like if this bipartisan group is able to reach a deal in time, it will likely be added to a final year spending package or a continuing resolution. The current continuing resolution, which is what keeps the government open and funded, that expires on December 11th. It is expected to be extended for 1 week until December 18th. So that gives Congress and these congressional leaders a little bit more time to negotiate a deal, because it's must-pass legislation that has to happen. So how can we best use the time that's ahead of us in this next handful of days? We want to encourage you to keep contacting your members of Congress and to demand that any relief package includes, one, at least $25 billion in emergency rental assistance, and that this rental assistance is targeted to people who are most at risk of losing their homes this winter. This is a place where you could have a real big influence on shaping how these resources get out the door. The second piece that we think is really critically important for members of Congress to hear from advocates about is about the need for a broad national eviction moratorium that would take place or continue those protections after the current CDC moratorium expires on December 31st. We continue to hear that an eviction moratorium is still on the table. It is not off the table, although they're looking at a relatively short period of time. We want to make sure that a moratorium is in place at least until resources are able, state and local governments are able to deploy emergency rental assistance and give it to households that are in need. You know, that's important for lots of different reasons, but it's important from a tenant perspective of making sure that people are able to stay in their homes, and a government perspective of making sure that those resources are actually working and for its intended purpose. But it's also critically important for landlords that this eviction moratorium is in place. When renters lose their homes, landlords are not eligible for emergency rental assistance. And so they need to be thinking about this moratorium as being the key to making sure that they can also get the resources they need to keep their properties going. Finally, because I mentioned before that the bipartisan arrangement doesn't include money for to address the health and housing needs of people who are currently experiencing homelessness, it's really critically important that we continue to press and advocate for the highest level of funding possible for both housing vouchers and emergency solutions grants. So a lot is happening over the next couple of days. A lot of decisions are being made, and this is a place where you can have enormous influence. I'm going to read out the names of the senators that are involved in this bipartisan group. I'm going to ask my colleague, maybe Kim, if she can put it into the chat box as well. Now, these are the 10 senators that are directly involved in the negotiations. So if you live in these states or if these are your senators, you have a really important task ahead of you to be weighing in with them. But don't be dismayed if your senator is not on this list, because it's really important that we are building support for this package so that when it goes to the Senate floor, there are enough votes for it. We have heard, as many of you have, that there might be as much as 20 Senate Republicans who are not interested in voting for any relief package. And the only way we can make sure that this gets through is if there's enough pressure, especially on Senate Republicans and Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, to bring this to the floor. So everybody has a role to play to make sure that resources rent relief is received. So the top, our biggest targets for this action are Susan Collins from Maine, Portman from Ohio, Romney from Utah, Cassidy from Louisiana, and Murkowski from Alaska. Also on the Democratic side, Warner from Virginia, Hassan and Shaheen from New Hampshire, King from Maine, and Manchin from West Virginia. So that's your task ahead of you. If you live in those states, those are your senators. It's incredibly important for you to be engaging. I see a bunch of questions who are coming in, and I'll try to answer as much of them as I can. There's a question from Robin about whether there's anything on housing relief in the omnibus negotiations. No, I don't believe that's the case. Appropriators are dealing with very low budget caps, and so it's very difficult for us realistically to see any increases that are needed on the spending bill, but that's what makes this package all the more important. And so, again, it's a really good opportunity for you guys to continue to engage in this. Will Tompkins is asking whether the White House has a role in these negotiations. That is still a big question mark. It's very hard to predict what President Trump will and will not do. We have heard that he is willing to vote on something if Mitch McConnell brings it to the floor. So I think our best use of our pressure right now is to be calling our senators, and especially our Republican senators, to push hard for this. Let's see. I see that there's questions about which senators are not interested. We don't have that list. That's sort of just a guess of what we've heard from Hill staff. So I'm not sure. So because we don't know which senators are not going to vote for any relief package, we should keep our sights very broad and try to engage with as many members of Congress, as many senators as possible. I see a question from Elena about the CDC moratorium. She says, we need a broader moratorium, needs to be applicable to all tenants, needs to be retroactive. And she points to a lot of loopholes that landlords have been using to get around the CDC eviction moratorium. I couldn't agree more with Elena. We know that while there are many shortcomings of the CDC moratorium, we're actively trying to encourage the CDC and Congress to fix those issues and to extend the moratorium and to strengthen it. I'm not sure if we'll be able to convince this bipartisan group of senators to make changes, but I think that's something we can definitely and are taking up with the incoming Biden administration and encouraging them to fix going forward. I see a question. Jerry, who's asking if these senators that I mentioned are going to be key to a rent relief package early next year. I think that's definitely the case. Engaging with them now, building those relationships now, hopefully will pay off again next year when we're able to push for a much larger package with the rest of the remaining resources that we need, the broad sweep of resources that aren't included in this package as well. Here's a question I see. Oh, lots of questions coming in. Sorry, trying to make sure I get to them. Is this assistance only limited to 3 months? Is that because of the high volume of people who need help? No, actually, that's not the reason why they're limiting it to $25 billion or limiting it to 3 months. I think this is a strategic move They know that more resources are needed, and by saying that it's for a 3-month period, it leaves open the door for us and other advocates to come back and to restart conversations about having a package in March. You'll see that I think the other resources that were mentioned in the bill, state and local relief, unemployment benefits, also have that same time frame. And I think the idea is that when we get to the end of March, again, there'll be more mounting pressure on Congress to do a deal. So that's sort of the thinking behind having a shorter time frame. I see a question about whether there's funding for homelessness programs in the package. No, unfortunately, there's not. It's very important that when you're reaching out to your senators, that you're making a push for those resources. We know that they are definitely needed on the local level, but right now this bill does not include them. I think part of that is because these senators are focused very much on what are the most urgent needs. And right now there are unspent emergency solutions grant funds for people experiencing homelessness. And so I think even though we know that the need is much greater, I think they think that that means that there's less of an urgency there. It's on us to educate them about why those funds are really needed and important. Just going to ask maybe a couple more questions. Anything related to rumors we're hearing about the Biden administration planning a moratorium through March? I can't say that I've heard anything directly on this. I know that we're engaging with the Biden administration. We're trying to encourage them to do something on this, but they haven't made any announcements just yet. Okay. So I see a lot of questions. There are a lot of good things here. What I'll do is we're going to keep moving on with our agenda. And if we have time at the end, we will make sure to come back to these questions. So don't forget your questions. We'll come back to them later. With that, I'm going to turn to our first speaker, who's going to speak a little bit more about the connection between COVID-19 and its impact on Black women. We're really glad to have Karma Kottman here from UJIMA, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. Karma, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. Go right ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you to all of you all for joining in, and thank you to Diane, Sarah, Kim, and the team at NLIHC for this opportunity. I wanted to just take a couple of minutes this afternoon to talk with you all about the impact on COVID-19 on Black survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, particularly because as we saw with at the beginning of COVID-19, there were a lot of discussions around the impact of COVID on survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So we've been doing a lot of work in the violence against women field and the interconnections with many of you all in terms of housing and housing access. On the impact of COVID on survivors. And so wanted to take this afternoon to talk with you about UJIMA. And thank you for going to the next slide. UJIMA is the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. We were formed in 2014 and are the National Resource Center on Violence Against Women and Family Violence for the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women for historically Black colleges and universities. We do work and define our community in its broadest sense. So UJIMA defines the Black community in 4 subgroups: African, African-American, African and African immigrant, Afro-Caribbean, and Afro-Latina. And that's really important to us because we want to lift up and recognize the importance of addressing the Black community holistically and recognizing that we are not a monolithic community. And very often when we talk about the Black community, we don't necessarily address our full diversity. And so Ujima embraces that in our programming and technical assistance. You can go to the next slide. Our areas of focus are domestic violence, sexual violence, community violence, and addressing institutional and structural violence. Next slide. We do this through a number of different ways. One, Ujima focuses on public policy. We have helped with the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, the Family Violence and Prevention Services Act, are working now to ensure funding, one, COVID relief for communities of color who are also experiencing domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as long-term funding that ensures access to culturally specific organizations for federal funding. We have a research and evaluation work group that looks at addressing the impact of all of these issues, domestic violence, sexual violence, community violence in the Black community, and addressing gaps in research as they relate to our experiences, one, with those violence, and as they relate to help seeking, and as we look at our access to culturally specific funding for domestic violence and sexual assault organizations. We provide education and outreach to communities. We host regional meetings and regional trainings. We are working now on developing a membership group, and we provide technical assistance and training. So you can access Ujima for a variety of technical assistance needs, anything from bias training, racial equity training, as well as provisions around domestic violence and sexual assault. We provide training for systems, individuals, and communities. Ujima defines our work in addressing power, because domestic violence and sexual violence are certainly steeped in and grounded in the abuse of power in relationships, whether they be in romantic relationships, whether they be in relationships with family, but they are essentially grounded in an abuse of power. And in addressing oppression in every form, whether we're talking about systemic racism, homophobia, whether we're talking about structural violence. So Ujima really does look at focusing in on oppression as critical to ensuring that Black survivors, Black communities have access to justice. Next slide. So particularly for today, we really wanted to talk more about the impact of COVID on communities of color and the Black community. So you'll hear me talk about communities of color as well, because it's really important to us that we also lift up the experiences of our Native sisters, of our Latina sisters, and Asian sisters who are also disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. So what we heard in the beginning in our experiences, as many of you all know, is that in the beginning of the COVID-19 public health emergency, when we had the stay-at-home orders, what we saw is that domestic violence and sexual assault survivors faced unique challenges. And many times they were also challenges that have been long-standing, particularly for marginalized communities. So when we looked at developing responses, we had to look at holistically addressing what have been long-standing issues for our communities. We know that women of color are overwhelmingly represented in the essential service industry, in jobs such as restaurant, domestic and janitorial services, and that then meant, first of all, that there was a higher vulnerability to sexual assault, and then that was coupled with an ongoing risk to contracting COVID-19. The lack of access, as we're all working on access to safe and affordable housing, certainly disparately impacts women of color, and disparately impacts survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So again, we saw the convergence of issues and continues to see the convergence of issues with COVID-19 and what have been long-standing issues in access for domestic violence and sexual assault survivors of color. And finally, what we know for children and youth of color, that we're currently at and have been at an increased risk for victimization and abuse as they continue to be sheltered in unhealthy home environments. And so these, as we talk about from Ujima's perspective, COVID-19 has exacerbated these situations for our communities, but they are not new. These are long-standing issues for our community. So at any time when we're looking at whether they be policy responses, program response, research, et cetera, we have to look at what those long-standing issues are in order to address them in order to address the impact of COVID and the convergence of these issues. Next slide. Thank you. So what we know is that intersectionality means increased vulnerability. Poverty, lack of housing or access to safe housing, disparities in the healthcare systems, disparity in mental health systems, disparities in the educational system, and the criminal legal system impact our communities disparately. And ultimately, what we see is that in the current culture, when you have these levels of disparities for communities of color and marginalized populations, then it equals increased vulnerability. So when situations or issues like what we're currently experiencing with COVID-19 happen across the country, it is in marginalized communities that you see a disparate impacts like you see today with COVID-19. As Ujima, when we talk about structural and institutional violence, it is key to addressing what are now being highlighted as issues related to COVID-19. So when we think about what we're experiencing in our communities in terms of access to things like fresh food, in terms of access to transportation, what we've seen for children of color who are falling behind because of lack of access to the internet, because of long-standing issues within the educational system, then they are grounded in and rooted in issues related to racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. And so being able to address these issues as they relate to COVID-19 means that we have to go back and address the structural and institutional violence that have been experienced by communities of color. And what that looks like for us particularly is in housing. The Ms. Foundation just did a report that I'm sure many of you all are familiar with that notes that people of color will be most hard hit by the expiration of federal aid, right? That 44% of Black tenants and 41% of Latino tenants reported that they had little or no confidence in their ability to pay rent. These numbers are astronomical. When we look at the number of evictions that disproportionately impact Black women, and that Black renters are nearly twice as likely as white renters to have evictions filed against them, then we know that the economic remedies that Sarah was talking about earlier today, when we think about what we need to engage in our policymakers, that we've got to then talk about how we get resources to those communities that are most marginalized and are most disparately impacted by evictions and other forms of housing instability. Next slide, please. And we can't talk about that from our perspective without also talking about the other systems that impact our lives. What we know about bias in policing, sexual misconduct, the rate of incarceration, those are particularly important when we look at housing instability because they do impact survivors' access to and ability to, one, access housing, but also to maintain. And so we cannot divorce, for us, we can't divorce folks' interaction with various systems that where they will be engaged in and will have implicit, whether implicit or explicit bias within those systems, and the interconnectivity to access to housing. Next slide. So ultimately, in our collective response does require that we have and acknowledge the link between long-standing historical inequities and the impact of COVID. So recognizing that all of these inequities have a historical perspective, and that for communities of color particularly, what we see overlaying the issues around economic access, around access to policy, education, et cetera, is also overlapping with historical trauma. And so when we look at how we get resources to survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault and into marginalized communities, is recognizing and understanding that we cannot do so without addressing survivors holistically. That recognizing that addressing violence against women has to be a central component of our recovery. For domestic violence and sexual assault survivors, and for those of us working to address homeless inadequacy, recognizing that for those of us who are addressing challenges with safe and affordable housing, and as we are looking at now addressing racial bias and racial justice, that we cannot then not address what has been longstanding issues also for women and girls of color. That part of addressing racial justice is also addressing gender justice. And that for us to ensure economic access to safe and affordable housing, and ultimately health equity, we've got to be able to do that in addressing of justice for all women. And then finally, we encourage all of us, as you all are doing your advocacy work around housing access and looking at the current legislation around COVID-19, one of the things that we are asking is that we also look at ensuring access to funding for culturally specific organizations. And by that, we mean organizations that are developed by and for communities of color. Because when we look at how all of these issues overlap, it is critically important that there be access to organizations that have an understanding of historical oppression, have an understanding of how housing access to criminal legal system supports, how all of those then intersect, and are ingrained in understanding the help-seeking systems that survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, those represented from communities of color, the ways that we access help, the ways that we access resources, the ways that we experience resiliency manifest in our lives. And in order to do so, we have to centralize the experiences of communities of color and ensure access for culturally specific organizations. And that's critically important because what we did not see in the first iteration of the CARES Act was specific funding for culturally specific organizations. We saw hundreds of millions of dollars go out the door. We saw funding go to states, but what there wasn't funding for were culturally specific responses. That is critically important when we look at addressing services for marginalized communities. So I would encourage you, as we're doing our advocacy, as we're looking at policies, that we also include a framing of ensuring that we're addressing bias, that we're addressing structural and systemic racism, that we are looking at policies from that lens, and that we are ensuring that culturally specific organizations, those are organizations that are by and for, have access to funding.
Thank you so much, Karma, for joining with us. That's a wonderful presentation. I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat box, thanking you for your presentation, thanking you for joining us with us today. A lot of people are pointing out the really intense, I don't know, I'm not coming up with the right word, the huge disparities in terms of people of color in the general population versus those who are experiencing homelessness. This is definitely an issue that is critically important for us to address, and I think you give us a really good marching orders to be advocating at our state and local level as resources are coming through to make sure that culturally specific organizations are getting those funds to be able to deploy them to households that are in need. And we know that without that sort of concerted effort, marginalized populations are often left behind over and over again. So I want to thank you for joining us. I'm going to encourage you to check out the questions in the Q&A box and our chat box, and feel free to keep responding to those questions there. Thank you so much for joining with us.
Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. Moving along, we're going to hear about a new report on evictions and barriers to housing opportunity with Rashida Phillips from the Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. Rashida, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Let me just share my screen.
I can hear you, Rashida. Go ahead.
Okay, I think I have to share my screen.
Rashida, you just have to tap on the screen twice and it should change over to your slides.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rashida Phillips. I am Managing Attorney of Housing Policy at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. I am happy to share about a new report that we put out called Breaking the Record, Dismantling the Barriers Eviction Records Place on Housing Opportunities. This report was put out last Monday, and it was written in collaboration with tenant organizers who are specifically impacted by eviction records, and most specifically the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative, which is a cooperative of organizers based here in Philadelphia. The report itself provides a lot of data on eviction records in Philadelphia and looks a little bit at Pennsylvania, but is mostly sort of focused on Philadelphia and some of the issues that we're seeing here in particular. And the issues that are posed and that we're talking about in the report, of course, are ones that are longstanding issues. But as you just heard in the amazing presentation before us, COVID-19 has really exacerbated this issue for many people, for many more people than before, and for Black and Brown communities in particular, who are sort of dually disproportionately impacted both by COVID-19 and high rates of eviction filings against them. And so we were motivated by the need for sort of immediate solutions that can help obviously keep people safe and at home, but we're also really thinking about exploring reforms to the eviction process and using this as an opportunity to think about that. So in Philadelphia, while we're, for example, we as a result of COVID-19, we have a diversion program, a pre-filing diversion program. So now is really an opportunity to connect these conversations about the long-term harms of eviction records and how we shouldn't be relying on the courts, to resolve some of these issues around housing, right? Because the risk is so great. The risk is that people will die or be more vulnerable to COVID-19 as well as other things. Next slide, please. So the report looks at a number of key findings. One of the things that we looked at is that eviction records are really a race and gender justice issue in Philadelphia and nationally, as you heard before me, and that the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly widened those disparities. And so some of the things that we looked at is we took a look at our recent eviction records and things from this year. And again, of course, as I said just a few minutes ago, this is, and as we all know, this has always been an issue, but the disparities are particularly great right now as a result of COVID. And so what we found was that 56% of all eviction filings occur in majority Black communities in Philadelphia. 81% of those eviction filings are in communities of color generally, right? And then almost half of those eviction filings during the pandemic are occurring in majority Black communities, while 78% of those filings occur in communities of color generally during the pandemic. So again, if this is an issue with the pandemic that's been exacerbated, but one that was pre-existing, and there's obviously very intricate intersections between those things, but really boosting this and highlighting this as a race and gender justice issue is really key. Next slide, please. So the next finding was that eviction records are easily accessible, even in circumstances where a tenant has won their case, where they've been able to work out an agreement, or where the landlord withdrew the case against the tenant. So in Philadelphia, the way that our eviction system, our eviction records work is that it's a website. It's on a website that anyone can really access. I mean, there's an opportunity to log in. You can get a sign up, but you can also log in as a guest user, and anyone can see all of those eviction records. And we don't have any ceiling protections or anything like that. So if you're a person who, you had an eviction record filed against you, you went to court, you won your case, you were maybe able to work out an agreement, or your landlord might have withdrew the case. It might have been resolved before anyone ever even went to court. Yet and still, all of those eviction records are accessible. And so what we found in this report is that over a quarter of the eviction filings from a particular time period did not result in a judgment against the tenant. So again, these are cases where the tenant won their case or the case was withdrawn. Yet and still, they have this mark on their record that could prevent them from renting in the future, because a tenant screening company is not going to add that nuance or may not have that context, or a landlord may just see the eviction record itself and may not bother to go any deeper to find out what actually happened in that case. And so again, over 25% of the cases where the tenant won the case or the case got withdrawn, they still have that eviction record that follows them far into the future. And then the other thing that we sort of highlight is that in Philadelphia, regardless of if you come up with an agreement, a court-ordered agreement, and you follow that agreement out, the agreement itself is called a judgment by agreement. So that means every single agreement that's going to come through the court is going to have a judgment attached to it. So that really just undermines the agreement or the fact that you were able to work something out because you still have a judgment against you, which is not necessarily required in order for the court to enforce the judgment. So for example, if you enter into an agreement and 6 months down the line, you as a tenant violate that agreement, it's not true that the court can't then intervene just because there's no judgment. So there's other ways that you can work through those things, and that's part of what we are encouraging is for the court to look at some of these policies, and for our policymakers to look at some of these policies and just create some guidelines around how these records should be used and treated under particular circumstances. So this is just a chart that shows, again, some of the things that I was talking about. The fact that over a quarter of the cases don't result in a judgment against the tenant yet are still accessible. 96% of judgments happen at the first hearing. And so in a situation where over 30% of our cases end up in default judgments, meaning that the tenant didn't get a chance to have their day in court or didn't show up to court for various reasons, these folks are carrying judgments with them, again, that follow them for many decades, if not for life. And then, the fact that few tenants are represented by attorneys. And so most tenants who do end up showing up to court, right, are not going to have legal representation, as well as the fact that, again, there are high rates of default judgments. And so the reason why this is relevant, of course, again, where you have a situation where 82% of landlords showing up to court have representation and only 10% of tenants have representation, right? You're going to have a situation where there's a fair amount of power imbalance where you have and see tenants who are not represented being intimidated, unfamiliar with the process, agreeing to have judgments entered against them, just things like that, without really, again, ending up in situations that follow them for life. This is, again, heightened at the pandemic, where you have additional fear. You have, you're for various reasons aren't able to leave the house, or you're more vulnerable to being infected with COVID. And so you're not going to potentially show up to court. There's reasons why the court is difficult to access itself. It's downtown. We only have one landlord-tenant court. And so anybody who doesn't live downtown, it's going to take time for them to travel. So there's various reasons why people either don't show up to court, or when they do show up to court, they're going to end up walking out with a judgment against them, regardless of what happened in that case. And so the last key finding is that landlords routinely rely on these tenant screening companies, internet searches, and other methods in order to readily access tenant eviction records, refusing to rent to tenants, even with one eviction filing on their record. And so the report just really explores how some of these tenant screening companies work, and again, the sort of impact of that when you don't have sort of guidelines or a process where you're determining things beyond just the eviction in terms of whether or not someone is going to be a good tenant, right? Or you're able to go beyond the record itself and look to the context of the circumstances and find out, why was that case filed, or why did that tenant lose that case, right? It might not be a situation that would automatically make them a bad tenant, right? So it's really taking a look at how these tenant screening companies will flatten a person's entire life experiences just simply by what's on that record. And so that brings me to some of the recommendations. There's 3 key recommendations that are in the report. One is to pass state legislation for sealing records and enact other court policies that seal or restrict access to eviction records. And so one of the great things is that earlier this year, we had a state representative introduce automatic eviction sealing law that was statewide and would have been it would have automatically sealed a record upon filing, but it would have provided certain circumstances upon which that record could be accessed, right? And so again, give some guidelines around how these records should be used and under which circumstances it's appropriate to consider them. Unfortunately, that bill did not move, and we're hoping to see it either reintroduced next year or something similar. But it's great to at least raise the issue and have it be taken seriously. And again, in particular, the pandemic has been an opportunity to really push some of these things that folks might not have thought about as a priority before. And then the second recommendation is to pass local protections restricting the use of eviction records and rental decisions and banning the use of blanket ban policies. And so under our Human Commissions regulations and here in Philadelphia, as well as our Fair Housing Commission, we're sort of exploring places where we can think about protections that, or not even protections, more guidelines. These are things for both landlords and tenants. It's meant for both parties to sort of be able to work their way through this process, because again, as my co-panelists shared previously, right, these things that sit at the intersections and that are disproportionately impacting Black women, Black people, because they are more likely to have these eviction records, right? You could be getting yourself into a situation where you are discriminating against folks in the admissions process. And so in order to avoid that, in order to avoid potential liability, right, having these laws are just as much useful for landlords as they are for tenants. And so having policies that say, look, you can't have a blanket ban policy, simple as that. You can't have a policy that says one eviction record or any eviction record is going to make you non-eligible for admission to my unit or to my housing site, right? Having a process where people do what's called an individualized review. They're taking into consideration other circumstances, references, credit checks, or other things that are not just the eviction record. And then again, having some other guidelines that just limit how eviction records can be used in rental decisions, whether it's, if you've won your case or if you've worked out an agreement and you've satisfied that agreement, people should not be able to have access to that record, so again, placing some limitations. And then finally looking at what the court itself can do in order to implement administrative rules that limit or seal access to eviction filing. So part of this, right, is also getting the court and shifting some of the culture of the court to say that this is an issue that they also need to be paying attention to, and that there are things that they can do through their own administrative rules that don't require, a statewide law to be passed or a city law to be passed, because of course that political process can play out all sorts of ways. And so getting the court and convincing the court that this will be a great thing, and this is something that we can, again, pair with pre-filing court and diversion programs and other things of that nature. So I'll end there and see if folks have any questions, and then thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rashida. I know that this is something lots of folks are starting to or continuing to worry about, especially if we know that there are going to be a lot of people who are facing eviction this winter, and we don't want to see those long-term effects as those eviction rulings, follow them. I am wondering, do you know of any states that have taken action so far to seal eviction records in the wake of COVID? I know you said your state is working on that, but do you know of any other states that have moved that forward?
I'm not sure offhand about states, but I know St. Paul, Minnesota has passed a local law that provides some measures around sealing records, as well as I think DC was also exploring a similar local law that would limit access to records. I'm not sure how far that one got, but I know the one in St. Paul did pass. But yeah, I'm not sure of current state legislation that's sort of in response to the pandemic. I know a lot of folks are looking at right to counsel and diversion programs around the country in different states. And so I think the conversations are coming up as part of that as well.
Yeah, I do see a question from Laura Massey, who's asking about whether you've looked at cases that were brought on by tenants against their landlords and what sort of barriers that might create for tenants when they're seeking housing in the future too. Did your report look at that?
It did not look at that because in Philadelphia, tenants cannot, tenants can file affirmative cases through our Fair Housing Commission, but those records aren't public. And so tenants cannot file affirmative cases through our landlord-tenant court. And so that's not an issue that we looked at specifically.
Okay, great. I see lots of people who are asking for copies of the report. So Kim, I saw, is sharing that in the chat box. Kim, if you could do that again, that'd be great because people want to dig in deeper. I'm seeing some comments from folks that are saying that California is sealed conditionally pre-COVID and unconditionally if COVID related. Colorado just implemented a limit eviction case suppression law. So there does seem to be some movement happening, which is great news. We don't have any time for more questions right now, Rashida, but I want to thank you for joining us. And if you have time to answer questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, I want to invite you to do that if you have time.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Our next speaker is Miranda Darden-Willems from Maryland Affordable Housing Coalition. Miranda, are you there?
I am, thank you. Good afternoon.
Great, go ahead.
Just a quick background, the Maryland Affordable Housing Coalition primarily represents affordable housing multifamily developers and their business partners who are building, owning, developing, managing affordable housing properties across the state of Maryland. And I'm going to give you a brief update on the efforts in Maryland to help prevent evictions and provide relief funds. So our statewide efforts are being managed by our state housing office. So if I say DHCD, that's the office I'm referring to. So our DHCD has two separate programs. The first is called the Assisted Housing Relief Fund, which my organization worked with DHCD staff to help implement this program. Our governor allocated $10 million in CRF funds for this program, and it provides eviction prevention assistance for tenants of multifamily properties that are in the DHCD loan portfolio. So these are primarily tax credit properties. And this program has been really great for a couple reasons. One, the tenants are only required to submit a one-page self-certification form to be eligible, and it's a very streamlined application process. So the property manager collects all the self-certification forms from their tenants, puts them into one spreadsheet, and submits them to DHCD in one single application. DHCD processes the application and then mails the property manager one check on behalf of all of the tenants with outstanding rents for that month. So the program has gone really well. Of the $10 million, they spent $8 million in the first 6 months of the program. So from April to September, they had spent $8 million. So they were able to open the program again for the month of October to spend the other $2 million. And in those first 6 months, 300 properties applied for assistance, and DHCD made over 5,000 rental payments on behalf of tenants. And of course, some of those are duplicates because they could apply each month. But they are processing their October invoices now. And then recently, our governor announced an additional $10 million in CRF funds to be split between this program and the local program. So we're looking at getting about another $5 million for the program to cover the rest of the year. So for the months of November and December, we'll also be able to assist these same tenants living in multifamily assisted properties across Maryland. So applications for November and December are due on December 18th. So the program has been going really well. They had some really easy process to follow. They also put together a one-page flyer, so we were able to get that out to the property so they could post it throughout the property to let the tenants know about the program. They've been following up with the tenants, and from what I understand, things have been going very well there. Then the second program they've been calling the Maryland Eviction Prevention Partnership. And this was created by DHCD to deploy their CDBG COVID funds across the state to help support the local eviction prevention program. So these are your tenant-based programs that are operating across the state on the local level. Just recently in November, the state awarded a little over $19 million to 17 local governments. Those awards range from as little as $39,000 for one of our small counties out in Western Maryland to a high of $3.5 million for Montgomery County, which is located just outside DC. And then they had previously awarded $2.2 million to 8 counties throughout the state. So to date, they've awarded about $21.5 million of their CDBG funds to various counties. So they put out an RFP and then awarded their funds to the various local jurisdictions to help their local programs. So that's how they've been spending their CDBG funds. And then I also just wanted to mention some other information about evictions, which this is not my area of specialty, so I would be limited in answering questions, but our governor renewed the state of emergency for Maryland last on November 25th. So we do still have an eviction moratorium in place in Maryland. So our courts cannot order any evictions for failure to pay rent cases due to COVID. However, our courts have gone back to phase 2 of reopening, and they are not hearing any more failure to pay rent cases until at least January 15th. They are only hearing emergency cases for breach of lease and holdover. And on the breach of lease cases, our state eviction moratorium is in effect. And on the holdover cases, there are no COVID protections. But they are hearing very limited cases in our court system. And we do have our utility cutoff and late fee moratorium has expired on utilities as of November 15th. So our utilities are allowed to terminate assistance, but my understanding is that they are working with residents and are trying not to turn anybody off as long as they're working with them and are making payment arrangements. So that's a brief update. Now I will just mention my county where I live, Anne Arundel County, has done a really great job at their local eviction prevention program using local funds as well as the state funds. They have hired an attorney. So they now have a staff attorney who specializes in eviction matters, housing cases. So they have an attorney on staff. In addition to just cutting checks for people to help keep them housed, they're also providing wraparound services. So they're providing counseling to these families. And most recently, they've also contracted with one of the legal aid organizations in Maryland, and they had a housing attorney stationed at the courthouse so that they could provide same-day legal representation to tenants who were showing up for failure to pay cases, which of course have now been put on hold again. But we've had some really great efforts on the local level to help tenants and make sure they're getting representation. And then finally, I'll just mention, because this came up in the last presentation, our state legislative session starts on January 13th, and I believe we are going to have a number of bills proposed to help protect tenants and to seal eviction records and prevent blanket bans. And I think we're going to see a whole host of tenant protection bills coming through our legislature next month. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Miranda. Great work going on in Maryland. I do see a couple questions if you have a minute more or so to stay on. One question's about, so it sounded like the statewide program is limited just to low-income housing tax credit properties. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what sort of protections or requirements are in place to make sure that those landlords aren't accepting rental assistance, but also, still continuing to charge back rent or still filing for evictions.
Yes, so the property has to be in the state's loan portfolio. So it has to have some kind of state loan on the property in order for it to be eligible for the Assisted Housing Relief Fund, because they have an existing relationship with the state's asset management department, which has an ongoing monitoring relationship with the property. So that's where they felt comfortable in doing these blanket applications. And then there is an agreement that the landlord has to sign in order to accept the funds, which includes that they will forgive any back rent and they will not pursue evictions through a certain date. So every month they apply for funds, I think they agree to go through the next future month and not file for eviction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. I'm also seeing questions who are asking, how did Anne Arundel County fund the county eviction lawyer position? How long is that position open for?
They had a combination of CDBG funds and local county funds. I know their county executive put several $1 million into the program, so I'm not sure which source of funds they're using. And I believe it's going to be a new permanent position at the local housing office in Anne Arundel County.
Great. And the last question, so it sounds like maybe your state is on track to spend down its CRF funds. I'm wondering if you could tell us also about how that looks for, you had mentioned using CDBG funds for the local program. How quickly are those funds being spent down?
I'm hearing that some jurisdictions are having trouble spending their funds in a timely manner, mostly just due to trying to track down tenants and follow up to get the additional documentation that various local governments are requiring. I'm hoping that they have scaled back the documents they're requiring, but I don't have an answer on each program, and I'm not sure that our state will spend all of their money by the end of the year. I think everybody's kind of waiting and hoping that the December 30th deadline will get extended into next year, so we have a little more time. But we're trying to spend as quickly as possible to reach out to as many tenants, to spend that money down before we potentially lose it.
Yeah, I mean, also seeing from Laura, who's agreeing with you, that she is also seeing documentations being a huge barrier for spending down funds in Massachusetts. And I know our research team has looked into this, and they're seeing the same thing in other states too, where complicated processes are meaning that fewer renters are applying or get through the application process, or that they just don't have the documents that are needed to prove that they're eligible. So it seems to be a consistent issue across the board.
Yes. And that's the great thing about our state program, is because it's funded with CRF dollars and not CDBG dollars, they've been able to streamline it and only require that one-page self-certification form. But I'm not sure the local counties feel comfortable with that when they're using federal CDBG dollars.
Yeah, that's interesting because I know that our research team had seen there definitely are some states using CRF funds that have these high documentation barriers. So I think maybe what the issue is that there's a lot of flexibility with CRF, and states either are using it to be as nimble as possible or are creating barriers to assistance. So it sounds like Maryland's doing a good job of trying to streamline that application process.
Yes.
Okay, well, some people are correctly reminding me to please explain what CRF and CDBG are. Thanks for calling me out on that. CRF are coronavirus relief funds. These are funds that go through the U.S. Treasury Department to state and local governments. It has a very flexible use, and some states are using that for rental assistance. CDBG is a community development block grant, and that goes to also to state and local governments, but for more limited purposes. Thank you for reminding me to explain that. And one last question, and then we'll move on, Miranda. Somebody is asking, is the Maryland self-certification something that can be done via cell phone? So many of our documents require them to be printed, and people don't have access to printers. Can people apply online?
So with that program, the property manager actually submits the application to the state. So the form has to go just from the tenant to the property management office. I don't know how they're accepting those, but I would imagine that the on-site office is providing hard copies of those forms at the office or outside the office door for anybody who needs them.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Miranda, for joining with us. If you have time to answer some questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, I invite you to do that. Thank you for spending some time updating us about what's going on in Maryland.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And we're going to move on to talk about another area where folks on the call can take action. We have a sign-on letter, and I'll ask Kim if she could share a link to it in our chat box. But we spoke a little bit earlier about some of the challenges with the CDC moratorium, not only that it's going to be ending on December 31st, but that we know that there are lots of loopholes that landlords have been exploiting to kick people out of their homes who really should be protected by this moratorium. We are making a push to try to get the CDC to extend the eviction moratorium and to improve it. By signing on, you can help us with that effort. I believe so far about 800 organizations or so have already signed on, so I encourage you guys to do so. In terms of the specific reforms that we're looking at, one of the big challenges that we've heard from folks on this call many times over the last several weeks has been that the moratorium requires renters to know about it and to take affirmative steps in order to be protected. We think that when the CDC extends its moratorium, they should rewrite it in a way that provides automatic protections to renters universally without them having to take any specific action to be protected. We also think that they need to have stronger protections to prevent landlords from wrongfully filing evictions. So if they were to keep their current declaration form process, we encourage them to do things like requiring landlords to provide notice to their tenants and prohibiting landlords from filing for evictions unless they are the ones attesting to the court that they have not received a signed declaration form. That way, we would be shifting the responsibility for these protections from renters who are very much dealing with their own struggles at the moment, and instead shift that to court systems and to landlords. The second reform that we have been pushing for is for the CDC to rescind a recent FAQ document that has opened the door to landlords taking more harmful actions over the last couple of months. So the CDC moratorium itself says that landlords can't take any action to pursue an eviction, but their FAQ contradicts that and says that landlords can file for eviction and take other steps in an eviction as long as people aren't physically removed from the house, we have seen time and again that means that renters are often harassed into leaving earlier, even though they should be protected. The other change we saw in that FAQ is that it states that landlords can question whether or not renters are telling the truth on their declaration forms. You know, we also see that as being a loophole to allow landlords to harass tenants and think that needs to be ended, as well as other loopholes that would extend the eviction moratorium to cover these other things that landlords are doing. So to cover no fault evictions, to cover evictions at the end of lease terms, et cetera. And finally, the letter calls for them to make a greater commitment to enforcing the moratorium. There are criminal penalties against landlords who wrongfully move forward with evictions, but so far no federal agency is actually implementing it. And we hear from lots of renters who are experiencing landlords who are doing the wrong thing, and there's really very little way for us to help them enforce their rights. So I encourage you all to please sign on to the letter by December 15th. Hopefully we can get something in a relief package, but if not, it'll really fall on our work with the CDC and all of our advocacy to push the CDC to take action. I'm going to pause there and see if people have any questions either about this sign-on letter, or I want to go back to our initial conversation about a relief package. I know there were lots of questions about what is in the bipartisan agreement, what is not, and I want to open that back up to questions for folks who might still have questions, since we have a little bit of time at the end here. If you could enter your questions into the chat box, and I'll go back and start answering some questions that other people had asked. Meredith Dodson asked about lots of folks have asked about what the estimate is on the need for rental assistance. I mentioned Moody's Analytics has a estimate that $70 billion in back rent is already owed. The National Council of State Housing Agencies says it's at $35 billion. It's very difficult to get real-time numbers on the amount of back rent because there's not great current data out there. Everyone's using the U.S. Census Bureau and other factors to try to estimate it, but we believe the amount of back rent is somewhere between $35 billion and $70 billion. I'm going to ask Kim, maybe she can share the link to the NCSHA study, if that's possible. More questions that people are asking. Is there anything in the new release extending the current RF funds? We've reached out to the bipartisan group to see if we can get more details. I know that there are definitely new funds for state and local fiscal relief, but I'm not sure where things are with the extension of existing funds. We know that that's very important because there are, I think, about $300+ million in CRF funded rental assistance that has not yet been spent down. And we want to make sure that as much and as many resources as possible are able to go towards that purpose. So if and when we hear of anything, we will let you know, but that could be another place where you could be engaging with your members of Congress to encourage them to include this in any deal. I see that folks are asking about back rent broken down by state. The National Council of State Housing Agencies report also has that. So you can see in the chat box that Kim has shared a link to that. You're welcome to go back and check that out too. Okay, so I feel like we have answered most people's questions. With that, we can close our meeting a little bit early today. I want to thank everybody for joining on. We have a large task ahead of us in making sure that Congress hears from us about the need for emergency rental assistance and other resources. We expect to hear something about a deal. Hopefully, they could reach a deal in as little as a few days. So this is really the most important time for you to be engaging with your members of Congress. As a reminder, we have a couple of asks that we're encouraging folks to be pushing for during this time. One, it's incredibly important to make sure that any deal to provide emergency rental assistance is targeted to the households that are most at risk of losing their homes, including those with the very lowest incomes. We know that $25 billion is a lot of money, but it's not enough to cover everybody's back rent. And that's why it's really critical that we're focusing on those people who are most at risk. The second thing we're pushing for is a broad national eviction moratorium. I mentioned before that it's in conversations, but we haven't heard anything definitive on this. We need to make sure that at least, at a minimum, that the CDC eviction moratorium is continued through the end of March, which would give state and local governments time to distribute rental assistance to households that are in need. And finally, because the $25 billion, to our knowledge, does not include money for emergency solutions grants to help serve people experiencing homelessness, we need to continue to push hard to make sure that those additional resources are added on top of the $25 billion. And with that, I want to thank you guys for joining so much. Thank you for your advocacy, and we'll be in touch soon.